This is Garis, Masculist MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 675, entitled The Masculist Antidote to the Dating Crisis. Description. In the US, over 60% of young men now refuse to date young women, causing a dating crisis with its enormous implications. This flyer explains how masculist knowledge spread to both sexes can be the antidote to this crisis. Now the flyer itself. The Masculist Antidote to the Dating Crisis by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Recently, Pew, P-E-W, Research Center, a reputable polling company in the US, found that 63% of young men in the US between 18 and 30 not only refuse to marry and reject paternity, in brackets, by refusing to give women their sperm, close brackets, but they, in capital letters, don't even date women. This statistic shocked a lot of people, including myself, since it's full of implications for the future of demographics, of sex, happiness, fulfillment, etc. This flyer claims that the rise of masculist ideas will play a major role in resolving the dating crisis in the US and similar Western countries. Upon hearing this incredible statistic for the first time, one's natural reaction is to ask, why? Why are so many young men refusing to date young women? This mass young male refusal to date women is now causing a tsunami of tearful TikToks of young women expressing their bitterness and despair of ever finding a man to share their life with, as they realize that they are now in their 30s and starting to lose their sexual attractiveness, brackets, that is, hitting the wall, as the Manosphereans say, close brackets. They are waking up in growing numbers that they are not going to get a man, and hence they will rot on the shelf for the rest of their lonely, miserable lives. So it should be clear that both sexes are suffering as a result of the dating crisis. The fact that over 60% of young US men refuse to date women makes this situation of crisis proportions that the politicians have barely started taking seriously. So humanity needs to start addressing this issue, or we will soon be wiping ourselves out as the birth rate continues to crash. So why are young US men refusing to date? One obvious way to determine why is simply to ask them. There are several reasons given to this question, but the main one that young men use is that they consider young women, quote, undateable, which is a term commonly used to explain why young men turn their noses up at young women. So why do so many young men consider young women undateable? These young men will then answer that young women have been poisoned by feminism, making them very unattractive to be with, so young men don't make the effort. They are tired of being labelled as toxic by feministed young women, being looked upon as the enemy of the feminists and the like. In masculist terminology, these young men are reacting to the monoconscious feminazi bitchery of young women, who feel they have the right to trash men for the ways that men oppress women, as taught them by feminism, monoconscious feminism. Since masculism, the other half of the gender political story, is still new to most men, and since the masculists are still having a hard time spreading masculist ideas to the general public, due largely to the influence of the femme mafia, in quotes, that is, the feminist media mafia, who block publication of masculist ideas in the media, which is easy for them, since in today's world the majority of journalists are female. So most young men have not yet been intellectually armed with masculist ideas, masculist rhetoric. So these young men are unable to answer back to the monoconscious feminists, and hence are unable to crush these monoconscious feminists' misandrist, sexist, hypocritical bigotry, since both these young men and society in general are not yet well informed that gender oppression is very much a two-way street, and that women oppress men worse with their many horrible, decades-lasting gender crimes against men. The big three being women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering, which are such serious gender crimes against men that masculists have a real hatred of such gender criminal women and are at war against them and effectively exterminate them by forcing them to rot on the shelf, by totally ignoring them, not even pumping and dumping them, causing them to die slow, miserable deaths, manless, sexless, loveless, babyless and spat at, utterly rejected both socially and sexually. So given the above, it should be obvious to readers that the solution of the dating crisis is simply to teach both sexes the core ideas of masculism. Masculists claim that both sexes will benefit from this spreading of masculist ideas to both sexes. I will now explain why the teaching of masculism to men will benefit men and how it will also benefit women. I'll start with the teaching of men. What happens when a previously monoconscious man starts learning masculist ideas? He becomes bi-conscious by definition. That is, he has both his feminist and his masculine consciousnesses raised. That is, he becomes familiar with both sets of ideas, learning that gender oppression is definitely a two-way street, and that in reality women oppress men worse with their big three gender crimes against men. Freshly bi-conscious masculists then feel they have the intellectual tools to not only hit back at the awful misandrist attitudes of monoconscious feminists, but to crush them in real masculinist anger and hatred, since bi-conscious masculists have no patience nor tolerance for monoconscious feminists, since bi-conscious masculists see monoconscious feminists as sexist, hypocritical bigots. Typically, when a bi-conscious masculist is confronted with a monoconscious feminist, he becomes angry and hateful at, in brackets, from his point of view, her awful hypocrisy, her attitude that women, that feminists, have the right to trash men publicly due to her belief that men oppress women, and her knowledge that most women she is talking to have been taught the same way as she has by feminism, that gender oppression is a one-way street, since most people in July 2024 are monoconscious. Most people have yet to be exposed to masculist ideas in the media, since masculism has yet to achieve a real breakthrough in media penetration. Once a bi-conscious masculist is well versed in masculist ideas, not only can he answer back to a misandrist feminazi bigot, that's MFB, but he can crush her with a verbally violent masculist diatribe, blasting her out of the room with something like the following statement, quote, "Learn some masculism, you misandrist, male-dumping, feminazi cunt, you sexist, hypocritical bigot. Learn that gender oppression is a two-way street and that women oppress men far worse than vice versa, with women's manslavery, women's divorce rape, women's forced fathering and the like. We bi-conscious masculists have a hatred of monoconscious feminazis and crush them when we come across them, punishing them so severely that these women are forced to rot on the shelf because masculisted men, who will soon be most men, refuse to have anything to do with them, causing them to die slow, miserable deaths, manless, loveless, sexless, babyless, and utterly rejected socially and sexually." End quote. When millions of bi-conscious masculisted men are haranguing monoconscious feminists this way, the tide will turn. So many millions of monoconscious feminists will be dumped by their former monoconscious male feminist boyfriends, partners, husbands, that in all their female pain, they will become strongly motivated to learn some masculism, so that the men who dump them might take them back, due to these women now being nicer to be with, having lost their monoconscious feminazi bitchery, since their monoconscious feminist anger at men for the ways that men oppress women will have been cancelled by their female masculinist anger at women for the ways that women oppress men. Being a lot less feminazi bitchy will make such women a lot more approachable by men. So these women will then be a lot more likely to get and to hold onto a boyfriend. Unlike today, when nearly 2/3 of young men in the US are so fed up with the toxic misandry of young women that these young men want nothing to do with them, finding them undateable, aka too feminazi bitchy. How will a knowledge of masculinist ideas help women? The answer to this question has largely been answered above. Men don't want relationships with, quote, misandrous, male-dumping, feminazi cunts, and punish them by totally ignoring them, spitting in their face for being sexist hypocrites, believing that men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed, which is the core teaching of feminism, when in reality, with a knowledge of masculism, thus making these men bi-conscious, they see that in fact women oppress men worse. So not surprisingly, a bi-conscious masculist will explode in rage and hatred at a monoconscious feminist for her awful sexist hypocrisy, for her thinking that gender oppression is a one-way street. So he will be powerfully motivated to set her straight by verbally, viciously, hatefully telling her in no uncertain terms that her monoconscious hypocritical sexism will make her hated, and that the longer she remains monoconscious, the more likely she is to lose the man in her life, if she has one, if he becomes bi-conscious before her, and so see her as a hypocritical bigot to be hated and dumped. So if monoconscious feminists want to keep the man in their lives, it's very much in their self-interest to learn some masculism, and before, in capital letters, he does. Because if it's the other way round, then there's a serious risk that she may be dumped by him for her insufferable, sexist, hypocritical bigotry, and not only be dumped, but be spat at for being vile, criminal, and utterly rejectable. Masculists not only target the men in monoconscious feminist lives, teaching them masculism for the reasons given above, but masculists also teach young women that the main reason for these young women's babylessness is due to the monoconscious feminist takeover of the divorce courts in the 70s, making them so toxic for divorcing fathers that now 2/3 of young men refuse to give young women their sperm. So the masculists are teaching these young women to hate the monoconscious feminist divorce court judges and lawyers as much as men do. So if these monoconscious feminist divorce court lawyers and judges bother to learn some masculism and learn of the hatred towards them coming from both sexes, then maybe they will be more inclined to become bi-conscious themselves, and then to vote with men for the men-fairing of the gender laws, for the fipping of women, brackets FIP, F-I-P equals financially independent person, for the fundamental reform of the divorce courts, basing them on the principle of financial independence of both divorcing parties, since both the fathers and the mothers will have been raised in a FIP society, where particularly young girls are socialized and educated to be FIPs, so they do not expect fluffy style to parasite off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving him, and for one father in 4, divorce raping him, making her, in the eyes of masculists, a man-slaving, divorce-raping vermin to be exterminated by masculisted men, forced to rot on the shelf, having her fluffy genes wiped from the gene pool. Now, jump ahead some years into the future, when nearly everyone is bi-conscious, so that nearly all women have lost their monoconscious feminazi bitchiness and have become much nicer to be with for men, so that we live in a FIP society, that the divorce courts have been men-faired, where the para, that's paternity rejection right, has been legislated, as well as the OPTAB, O-P-T-A-B, obligatory paternity testing at birth for all births to combat women's paternity fraud, when GECs, GECs, gender equality committees, have been set up in the parliaments that consist half of female feminists and half of male masculists, so that the gender issues of both sexes are dealt with equally. Then young men will be a lot more willing to approach young women and date them, and will be a lot more willing to be fathers again, unlike today, in the horrific, monoconscious, feminist-controlled divorce courts, where one father in 4 is butchered, having his life destroyed, a casualty rate worse than in a major war. So, in summarising, if men are to date women again, a lot of gender politics need to be undertaken on the masculist side. The masculist politicians in the GECs will have their hands full as they men-fair the gender laws and cause masculist ideas to be as widely known in society as feminist ideas. Given bi-conscious masculist hatred of monoconscious feminist bigotry, there is a lot of water that has to flow under the gender political bridge before young men are prepared to date young women again. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. Click on the Masculist tab for 670 plus Masculist essays and their videos. See also a London Reel interview on Masculism at AI will kill 1 billion people. Do we create our exterminators? ? Professor Hugo de Garis. London Reel. Brackets. See the last half hour of this 2-hour interview for the Masculist segments and other clips on YouTube. These flyers are available in text and video formats on Minds, BitChute, Odyssey, MGTOW.tv and X. Ciao.